Three measures of generational power and wealth. Wealth and control are on the move, sped up by the pandemic. These three measures will help you identify the changes and retain the assets from generational customers for your firm.
This is The Rare Advisor, proud to be a part of the Advisor Advancement Network and home of a business model supercharged by recurring and repeatable events. Your host is Mike Walters, CEO of USA Financial. He is an investment advisor representative of and securities are offered through USA Financial Securities, member FINRA SIPC, a registered investment advisor.
Hey, welcome everyone. Today, I want to spend some time diving into what I think you're going to find some crazy interesting data. This information was put up by Visual Capitalist, and it's kind of redefining how we think about wealth here in the United States, how we think about the transition of that wealth, and then bringing it into an overall encompassing view of what they refer to as power, meaning political power, economic power, as well as cultural power. And today that relates to media, the 24/7 media we live in, the social media environment we live in, how people influence or are being influenced by the news cycles, by the traditional news sources, but now also by all these extra social media based and influential or influencer based media outlets. So I think it gives you a really good concept of how the moving target of your customer is being defined in the marketplace, because there is definitely a transition that's taking place. And I would contend that that transition has been sped up thanks to the pandemic, meaning that some of your silent generations or your probably more so your baby boomer generations, many of them have gone into retirement because of the pandemic. Maybe they weren't going to pull that trigger another year or two or three or even five into the future. But now with all the changes taking place, they've just decided, you know what? It's kind of nice. When I was at home with my spouse, we did a few things that we probably would have done during retirement. We're really ready. Let's just pull the trigger now. The other thing that's happened is because we all got so home-based, because we all are dealing so much with the digital world, the way I'm communicating with you right now, the advancement of that piece of media and how that distribution model works. Again, it doesn't matter if you're talking about ABC, NBC, CBS, CNBC, Fox News, whatever. The traditional news sources are embracing this, but so are all the, lack of a better word, non-traditional news sources, the social media-based sources, the influential or influencer-based sources. All of that's getting pushed in front of people now. So things are changing. The way we interact at a business level has changed dramatically, and all of this is influencing who your customer is and the changes your customer is going through and how that evolutionary process has been somewhat sped up. So I really love that Visual Capitalist has taken it upon themselves to create this new study. I think you should take a look at the whole study. I'm going to lift out just three components, the three shifting measures that are there to really pinpoint, identify, target, profile for you who people are, where they're going. It's it's super interesting. Let's take a quick look. I'm going to share a screen with you here. And the first thing I want to make sure is that you really do understand what we've already known right here. Baby boomers are still controlling the vast majority of the wealth. Right now, they say it's 53% of the U.S. wealth. Many would probably say that's low, but through their research, they're coming up with a number 53%. So however you feel about that, I would say you at least know that baby boomers are still managing or in control of or have secured under their guise, they have secured over 53% of the U.S. wealth. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a direct relation to their power. It might be a direct relation to some of their economic power, but it's not necessarily a direct relation to their overall power. And so that's what's kind of interesting. Now, they're also telling us that 3/4 of the S&P 500 companies are still being led by baby boomers. So again, another thing in the baby boomer category. And then finally, the majority of positions in federal and state governments are still being held by the baby boomers. So in total, the way they're running their algorithms and they're doing their math, almost 39% of the overall power is in control here by the baby boomers. But what's really interesting is what's happening around it. Whether we're looking at the silent generation, the Gen X, or the millennials. So let's move over here to the upper right, because the first thing I want you to see is how these numbers are trending and what they relate to. So baby boomers, they're saying their total economic power, which goes beyond just control of wealth. It means how do they influence economic power? Their total economic power, they're saying, is 43.4%. Their total political power, 47.4%. But look what happens to cultural power, 25.1%. In fact, you'll see that Gen X is coming in at a higher cultural power, and millennials, and keep in mind, millennials are simply ages 25 to 48 right now. Excuse me, to 40, 25 to 40. They are almost at the same level of cultural power. Now, the reason that is because the baby boomers have not embraced, they're not the leaders in media influence. They are no longer the heads of some of the large media outlets, and they most specifically are not the leaders of the social media outlets and or the influencers within those social media outlets. We're seeing a lot more Gen X and millennials coming up strong in that category. But let's go back and start with economic power again now. So economic power, we're seeing 26.2, but then look at this drop. Big drop to the millennials, and yet look at their cultural power. So it's kind of interesting. Here we are, baby boomers. They are winning in the economic and political powers, but they're not winning in the cultural power. Gen X's, although they are kind of in the same category, 26 and 29, just like the baby boomers are 43 and 47. So the kind of similar numeric relations, if you will, between those two categories. But then look what happens. We see a big inversion over here that we just talked about. So that's pretty significant. The other thing that's significant is obviously you can see that the silent generation is somewhat being left behind. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just technology has changed. Older people don't tend to keep up with it as much as they have in the past. But the other argument I would make is that the silent generation actually took a step forward, actually recaptured some beachhead and made up some ground, I believe, in that cultural power area, especially by the fact that they're at least digesting now some of the media in ways they weren't before. Just like, prior to the pandemic, you've heard me talk about this. During the pandemic, we were able to digitally advance older customers a decade down the road because of the pandemic. Once we went to those lockdowns, they wanted to interact with the children and the grandchildren, and the only way they could do that was to learn how to use Zoom and other tools like that. So it's gotten them over a learning curve that they probably honestly would have never addressed otherwise. So there are changes and movement that are happening constantly. Now, as a financial advisor, this is something that you should be keeping very close track on. This is the wealth and how the U.S. wealth is divided out, and going back in time, how it was divided out. So back here is 1989 on the left, coming up to 2019 and actually 2020, the way this chart works. The top group, the purple here, this purple represents the silent generation. So you can see if you go back 20 years at how much greater of the U.S. household wealth they controlled versus today. And then look what's happened with the baby boomers. So the baby boomers are fitting between these two trend lines, these swaths. So the baby boomer gap is increasing, as you would expect it to, not only because they're getting into higher paying and the more influential jobs, but also because they're receiving inheritance from the silent generation as they pass. And then we see a similar thing happening down below this line with the Gen Xers to a lesser degree, but you can see there's a little jump up right here. And some of that wealth jump up in the last few years has to do with tech companies and the influence that millennials have and or the control or ownership they have in those tech companies. And then finally, or the Gen Xers, I'm sorry, I think I said millennials, the Gen Xers. And then finally down here at the bottom, we see the millennials who still financially have a long way to go, but they are influencing. Remember what we said up here, back up here, if you can see my scribbles amongst all the other scribbles, they're influencing things in ways that are beyond their economic power, which means, generally speaking, that will lift their economic power as they move through time. So what does all this say? Well, here's a number of things what it says. Two of the most damning statistics that exist for financial advisors are first, that 70% of widows will fire their financial advisor once their spouse dies. And when you consider the fact that 70% of women will experience widowhood, and then another 70% of them will fire their financial advisor once they experience that widowhood, you can realize what a huge swath of assets that is that will leave or be dislodged from a financial practice. And then on top of that, they tell us, statistically speaking, that 66% of the children receiving an inheritance will fire the financial advisor once they've received the inheritance. So if father dies first, there's a 70% chance that surviving spouse, mom, is going to fire the financial advisor. And then when mom dies, there's a 66% chance that the kids are going to fire the financial advisor. This is why you have to embrace the generations. Now think back about the stats and the numbers I just gave you and how those generations are growing in power. Now it's even more important than ever before that you embrace the relationship with the generations, with the multiple spouses, with the generations, making sure that the surviving spouse realizes the plan was built for them, and make sure that the adult children understand that this financial plan is in their best interest as well. So many times, advisors historically have made the mistake, statistically speaking. By the way, these stats coming from Investment News. I'm not making those up. You can go research them and pull them up yourself. Investment News gave us those stats, and that's telling us that the average financial advisor does a piss poor job of relating to both spouses. In other words, they maintain a tight relationship, most likely with the primary individual they're interacting with, and then the other individual feels left out. Well, in that widow versus widower scenario, if the situation is the husband was in charge of the finances and he dies first, the wife feels like that was her husband's financial advisor. Now she needs a financial advisor to look out for her best interest. When in reality, the husband and the financial advisor probably built the plan in order to protect and manage for the life of the surviving spouse. Because oftentimes the men, it's just kind of built into their psyche, especially the silent generation men. They're assuming their spouses will outlive them. And they plan financially for that oftentimes. I know my parents think that way, and I've had these conversations with my father. My father is always thinking he was telling me years ago that he wasn't going to make it to the age that he is, and here he is. So that's just a mentality that used to exist. Does it still exist? You can argue about that. You can think that through for yourself. But I'm telling you, in the older generations, it definitely existed. So you need to make sure that that spouse, it doesn't matter if it's the male or the female, the surviving spouse, meaning both of them, have to adhere to you as the financial advisor. And then a step further. If you're not running annual meetings, maybe you do it during the holidays from Thanksgiving to New Year's. That's what we usually recommend. But if you're not meeting and having interactions with the adult children, and by the way, digitally, how much easier can it possibly get now, right? If I'm not having those interactions so that the adult children realize, and I can have my client with me sharing this conversation, let them spearhead it, or sometimes they may want me to spearhead it. We'll share that conversation together, but I want to make sure that the entire family realizes this plan was put together in their best interest. That's what will secure for you the generational assets. Because again, if you're building value for your firm, the number one risk you now run is assets and customers leaving your practice. And when we know statistically that 70% of widows are firing their financial advisor upon widowhood, and we know that 66% of the kids are firing their financial advisor upon receiving an inheritance, you can't get more significant than that in terms of assets potentially leaving your practice. So it's a great Great study. You can dive so deep in that thing. I just glossed the surface with three main points: economic power, political power, and cultural power. But take a look at that. It's at Visual Capitalist, which is simply visualcapitalist.com. You can pull up some of their information. And like I said, they've got a new 33-page study called the Generational Power Report, which I think is a must read for financial advisors. Hey, hope you enjoyed this. We'll talk again soon.